not be around for much longer, or that he was going back to India?
We all thought that he might not return to normal health and that he might die. So we were in a very serious mood of praying in San Francisco. I think that was the case for all devotees who knew him.
And then upon his return, we also had Shamasundar Prabhu talk about this kind of sense of urgency to help the Swami upon his return from India, that we want to do something big for him and his movement and really grow it. When did that momentum start for you, and how if you could speak to that sort of on his return, how things started to gain momentum in the movement, leading us into London.
In my mind, there wasn't much of a sense of a burgeoning, growing movement and having to help. My going to another country across the pond was just part of the evolution of my life.
So if we could then speak about London, whose idea was it? How did the idea to go to London come about?
I just, among friends, had the idea that we should go to Europe. And London seemed like the most logical place because at least they speak English there.
What was happening in London in and around that time?
In and around that time in London, not much was happening. I mean, not much exciting. It was just business as usual. I remember passing a policeman on the streets of London, and I heard him say, strange garb, meaning that, these guys are weird.
Meaning you?
Yeah, meaning me and my colleagues that were dressed differently than most Londoners.
You didn't go, though, shaved up, was it? Was it that while you were in London, I know Shamasundar Prabhu talked about this as well, that you decided to stand out in amongst the crowd? He said, oh, we've got to shave our heads, and he sort of went, oh, my curly hair,
I kind of made the decision that in London that it would be necessary to shave heads and always wear devotee clothes as much as possible so that I would get noticed more, and that I would be what I am and not try to hide it.
Was that a little challenging for you at first, or?
It was a bit, dressing like a devotee and having a shaved head was very uncomfortable at first, because the conservative people in England tended to look kind of at something and then go back to reading their newspapers. But it registered in their minds that this guy is really strange.
Could you describe briefly some of the early difficulties that you had while you were in London as a group that you faced?
The most difficult thing about being in England was the weather. It was always cold and rainy and damp. And that was the biggest challenge that I faced.
And perhaps you could expand upon, in amongst certain difficulties, how getting letters from the Swami really was an exciting thing, to get a letter from the Swami.
The only thing I think that kept the devotees in England that I went over there with, which was about 5 people, were getting letters from the Swami who would write very encouraging words to us. And because he didn't come to England for about a year, that was our only contact with the movement. But we still felt very much in the missionary spirit, even without the letters. But when we got the letters, it was like a big boost. It was a big, kind of support. Because when we went to England, we didn't have any support, little money, and no people that we knew.
How did Srila Prabhupada in general manage the movement by letter writing?
Well, that's one of the most amazing things about Prabhupada, how he managed the movement through letter writing. I mean, there's many CEOs of international companies, but they travel a lot, and Prabhupada did all his management by letter writing. And part of the reason that he was so successful with his letter writing campaign was that most of the people that he was writing to were his disciples, so they would be encouraged as to what he wrote, and they tended to do whatever he asked, although he didn't ask very much.
Do you have a specific example that comes to mind of a letter that you wrote to Prabhupada during that time in London and some advice that he gave you?
No.
Okay, that's no worries. I thought on the off chance I'd sneak that one in. Prabhupada introduced these 4 regulative principles to people, which he was obviously, that was it for him. He wasn't going to compromise. Some people could tend to balk at these principles and say that's not for me. What was your experience of hearing about these principles and incorporating them in your life?
When I first heard about the 4 regulative principles, I thought they were very strange, and I kind of thought, well, I'll never be able to follow these. And some of them have been compromised, but Prabhupada was very boastful about it. When he